Hydrangeas are one of the most amazing flowers you can have in the garden, and I've come here to Signature Hydrangeas in Kent to talk to hydrangea specialist Roger Butler about how to choose and care for hydrangeas. It's Alexandra here from the Middle Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog. Hydrangeas start to flower around midsummer and they go on often until around the end of November. Some of their flowers keep their shape in winter, so they look fantastic in frosty gardens, and others have leaves which contribute to autumn colour because they change into wonderful reds and golds. On top of that, hydrangeas grow in almost any soil. They adore the shade, and some of them are quite happy in the sun, and they also will grow in quite difficult conditions like woodland gardens or coastal gardens. And hydrangeas are fairly trouble-free when it comes to pests. Deer and rabbits actually don't like them because the leaves are slightly toxic. And when it comes to slugs and snails, Roger Butler says that there is a small problem there, but actually you can deal with it using natural methods. At Signature Hydrangeas, they have fairly wildlife-friendly gardening. And so they do use some organic slug and snail control, such as nematodes, but otherwise the birds and the hedgehogs and the frogs take care of their slug and snail problem. And I've certainly found that in my garden. I've never seen any slug or snail damage on my hydrangeas. There are 4 different kinds of hydrangea, and it's a good idea to know the difference because you need to prune them in different ways. The most common sort of hydrangea is the macrophylla, and that's the hydrangea that most of us think of. And those divide into 2 types. There's the mopheads and the lacecaps. The mopheads are just simply round balls. They're like mopheads. And the lacecaps have a rather delicate filigree appearance in the centre where they've got little buds and then open flowers around the outside. Mopheads and lacecaps both need to be pruned in February or in early spring, and Roger suggests that you simply snip off the dead flowers and 1 set of leaves, and you leave below a fat bud which will be the next summer's flowers. If you cut back the stems of mopheads and lacecaps too far, you will actually cut off the flower buds. The next 2 types of hydrangea are growing in popularity. One of them you've probably seen in designer gardens a lot over the last 10 years, and that's Hydrangea arborescens. Arborescens hydrangeas are known as wild hydrangeas in the United States, or even smooth hydrangeas. And along with paniculatas, they need really hard pruning. Paniculata hydrangeas have got cone-shaped flowers, and Roger says that these are growing in popularity really fast. He's noticed more people buying paniculatas over the last few years than any other kind of hydrangea. When you're pruning arborescens and paniculatas, you need to prune them right down hard, down to the last 2 buds from the ground. And once again, this is done in February or early March. And the last type of hydrangea that I'll talk about is the Oakleaf hydrangeas, and you can recognise these because their leaves are quite literally like oak tree leaves. The foliage of Oakleaf hydrangeas changes colour in the autumn, so they're a wonderful part of the autumn garden, and they only need very light pruning. Oakleaf hydrangeas will generally withstand drought and cold even better than any of the other hydrangeas, so they are good for difficult conditions. And all you need to do when pruning them in February or early March is to snip off the dead flowers and take out any stems that are spoiling the shape. They really only need very light pruning. So let's get on to how to choose and care for hydrangeas. Roger says that one of the things that puzzle people most about hydrangeas is the issue of their colour.
Well, hydrangeas, hydrangea macrophylla and serrata varieties change their colour with the acidity of the soil, and this plant here has been grown in a very acid soil of a pH of 5, and it has a lot of aluminium sulfate watered into or actually it's in a slow release form here in the compost, which is why it's such lovely blue. If that was growing on an alkaline soil, it would be deep pink. White is white, doesn't matter what happens. When they get old, the white flowers, they do change, so some of them go pink.
What would you advise? How should we choose hydrangeas?
Well, you should consider the site that you're using to start with. If you have a sunny site, you're better off planting paniculatas or arborescens varieties, and if you've got light to heavy shade or woodland conditions, the macrophyllas and the serratas are the best bet.
And where in the garden, is there any particular place in the garden you ought to grow your hydrangeas?
Well, if you're growing macrophyllas, they don't need to be in full sun, because in a hot summer the flowers will burn, particularly the white ones. So you're better off to keep them in a shady spot or a light shade, so that they're not in sun all day.
And otherwise you can just put the others anywhere, really.
The paniculatas like being in full sun, and the arborescens varieties like Annabelle like being in full sun.
And what is the best time of year to plant a hydrangea?
Well, you can plant them virtually any time of the year, as long as you care for them properly and water them well during the summer.
Which plants grow well with hydrangeas?
Well, generally I would suggest that you grow hydrangeas on their own, because the macrophyllas are quite dense plants, and it's not particularly good to have plants that need sun right next to them. My personal feeling is that they look better planted on their own, although you can dot them in borders in groups.
Can they be moved? If you've got a hydrangea in one place and you think you've put it in the wrong place, can you move it?
Yes, you can move them. The best time to move them once you've planted them is the end of October, early November, and plant them and get them back in the ground as soon as possible.
And do hydrangeas grow indoors at all?
Lots of the macrophyllas now are grown as pot plants, patio pot plants and house plants, and these of course are forced, because you can buy hydrangeas in flower from February through till November.
Could you plant those out in the garden afterwards?
You can definitely, but you've got to be quite careful at what time of the year you plant them out. I would suggest that if you have plants that are flowering early, it's fine to plant them out after they've finished flowering. But if you're having plants that flower, say, from September onwards, it's best to keep them in the pots and plant them out in the spring, because their season has been totally interrupted by being in cold store and then forced under glass.
What if your hydrangea is wilting? What should you do?
Well, usually hydrangeas that are wilting are ones that are still in pots, and it's usually they're too dry, or they've been stood in water and lost a lot of root. So if they're dry, soak them completely, and if they're sitting in water, let the water drain away.
And do you need to feed hydrangeas?
Yes, they're quite gross feeders. You feed them in the spring. We feed them with Osmocote, which is a coated slow release fertiliser. In the garden you can use blood, fish and bone, which is ideal for it. And I would feed them at the end of February or early March, and possibly again in sort of July, early August after they flower, but not too much fertiliser for the autumn.
And are there any particular hydrangeas that attract bees?
The bees seem to like the lacecap varieties and the paniculatas.
And what would you say to people who are worried that their hydrangeas are not flowering?
Quite often the plants that don't flower have been pruned incorrectly. When you grow Hydrangea macrophylla, you must understand that the flowering buds for next year are in these shoots, and they're not down close to the ground. So if you cut them back, if you cut sort of half or more of the stems off, all you're going to do is get growth buds and no flower. That is true for 95% of the varieties, although some of the newer varieties are repeat flowering ones.
What do you do with hydrangeas in winter?
If they're in pots, I would suggest that they're put somewhere where they can't get too cold in really cold easterly winds if the temperature's dropping below -5 or 6. Apart from that, they're fine outside.
Yeah, so they're fine in the garden.
Yeah.
And are there any particular ones that keep their heads particularly well in the winter?
Well, quite a lot of the macrophyllas do keep their heads if they're not in too moist a condition in the autumn. And of course they change colour from when they're flowering through till the autumn, and then when they go dry in the winter, they look particularly attractive in frosty weather.
Lovely. And also, which ones are good for foliage?
Foliage, there are some varieties like this one, which is Dulissa, which has that purple foliage all of the time. Some of the serratas, like Bluebird, colour up nicely in the autumn.
If you've enjoyed this, do please hit like, because then I'll know you'd like to hear more about individual plants. And if you'd like a gorgeous garden, but you're often short of time or money or expertise, then do subscribe to the Middle Sized Garden YouTube channel for tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.